The poultry geneticist's name was Dr. Renata Voss, and she had been studying heritage chicken breeds at Clemson University for 13 years. She specialized in the genetics of eggshell pigmentation, a narrow field, but one with a surprising amount of unresolved science in it. Because the genes that produced blue and green eggshells were old genes, introduced to domestic chicken populations centuries ago through South American breeds. And the specific genetic pathways have been diluted and recombined so many times for commercial breeding that tracing any given flock's blue egg genetics back to its origin was usually impossible. She had given up trying, for the most part. Most blue egg flocks in the modern poultry world descended from 20th century commercial Araucana and Americana lines, themselves derived from a confused tangle of early 20th century imports and crosses. The original South American lineages, the birds that had carried the blue egg gene before it was bred into commercial stock, were, as far as Renata's research had established, gone, absorbed, recombined into everything else. She had not expected to find an exception in Pickens County, South Carolina, in March 2022. She had come because a food blogger named Marisol Hayes had posted photographs of eggs from a farm stand outside Pickens. A dozen eggs in shades of deep teal and slate blue, darker and more saturated than the pale blue-green of typical Americana eggs. Marisol had bought them out of curiosity, and had cooked with them, and had written that the yolks were a deep orange, and the whites had an unusually firm texture, and had asked, half joking, whether anyone knew what breed produced eggs this color. A retired extension agent in Anderson County had seen the post and had said, "That's Eunice Tate's flock. Nobody's looked at those birds properly in 50 years. Renata had seen the extension agent's comment, forwarded by a colleague, and had looked at Marisol's photographs for a long time. The egg color was outside the range she associated with any documented modern blue egg line. Not impossibly so. Egg color varied within breeds and across individual birds. But the saturation and the specific teal undertone were unusual enough that she had decided a drive to Pickens County was worth a Saturday. Eunice Tate was 73 years old and kept 41 chickens in a fenced yard behind a farmhouse on a gravel road outside Pickens, in the foothills where the Blue Ridge began its rise toward North Carolina. She was a small woman with a round face, sharp dark eyes, and gray hair cut short and practical. She wore the clothes of someone who worked outside in all weather: overalls over a flannel shirt, rubber boots, a canvas coat with deep pockets that she used for carrying eggs, feed scoops, and whatever else needed carrying on a given morning. She had been in the chicken yard when Renata's car pulled up, scattering feed from a bucket in the methodical half-circle pattern of someone who had done this exact motion every morning for decades. She had looked up when the car door closed and had watched Renata walk to the fence with the specific watchfulness of someone assessing a stranger before deciding how much attention the stranger deserved. Renata had introduced herself. She had said she was from Clemson, that she worked on poultry genetics, that she had seen photographs of eggs from this address and wondered if she could ask some questions. Eunice had looked at her for a moment. She had said, "Marisol's photographs." Renata had said, "Yes." Eunice had said, "I told her not to put my address on those." Renata had said, "She didn't." The extension agent in Anderson County recognized the flock. Eunice had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Hal Pruitt." Renata had said, "I don't know his first name." Eunice had said, "It's Hal. He's been trying to get someone to look at these birds for 30 years. She had set down the feed bucket. She had said, "I suppose it was going to happen eventually. Come on in. I'll show you the birds properly." The flock Renata saw inside the fence was visually distinctive in ways that went beyond the egg color. The birds were smaller than standard Americana, compact, with a tighter feather structure and a slate blue and charcoal gray plumage pattern that Renata did not immediately associate with any documented variety. Several birds had small, irregular ear tufts, feathered protrusions near the ear opening, a trait associated with the South American Araucana ancestry, but expressed here in a form that looked different from the standardized tufted Araucana breed standard. The eggs, when Eunice brought a basket from the henhouse, were the deep teal blue of Marisol's photographs, darker and more saturated than any blue egg Renata had handled in 13 years of fieldwork. She had asked, "Where did this flock come from?" Eunice had said, "My mother." Renata had said, "And before your mother?" Eunice had said, "That's the part that takes a while to explain." She had gestured toward the porch. She had said, "I'll make coffee." Eunice's mother, Eunice Tate, had been born in 1921 in the upcountry of South Carolina, in a farming community near the North Carolina line, where her own mother, Eunice's grandmother, a woman named Florence, had kept a small flock of chickens that Florence had described when Idella was a girl as having come from her own mother's flock, which had come from a flock that a great-uncle had brought back from the sea voyage sometime in the 1880s. The story, as it had been passed down through the family, was that the great-uncle, a man named Aaron Whitfield, who had worked as a ship's carpenter out of Charleston, had acquired a small number of chickens during a stop in Chile in the 1880s. Ship's carpenters and other crew members occasionally brought live poultry aboard for fresh eggs during long voyages, and it was not unusual for surviving birds to be given away or sold at the home port rather than slaughtered. Aaron had brought several birds back to Charleston and had given them to his sister, Florence's mother, who kept them on a small property outside the city. The birds had laid blue eggs. This had been considered in the family's account a curiosity and a source of some local interest. Blue eggs were not common in South Carolina poultry yards in the 1880s, and Florence's mother's flock had developed something of a local reputation. When Florence married and moved to the upcountry in the early 1900s, she had taken birds from this flock with her. She had maintained the line, breeding selectively, as rural households did, for the qualities that mattered to the household: good laying, hardiness, the specific blue egg color that had become, by Florence's generation, simply what the family's chickens did, an unremarkable fact about their flock, the way any flock had its particular characteristics. Idella had grown up with these birds and had taken some of the line with her when she married in 1943 and moved to the Pickens County property, where Eunice had grown up and where Eunice still lived. Idella had kept the flock for the rest of her life, through the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s, maintaining the same selective breeding practice Florence had used, choosing breeding stock based on the qualities that mattered: laying performance, hardiness, and the blue egg color that had by this point been a defining feature of the family's flock for 4 generations. Idella had died in 1976. Eunice had been 27 years old, married with a young child, living on the same property. She had taken over the flock because someone needed to, and because she had grown up around it and knew, in the practical sense that came from a lifetime of proximity, what the birds needed. The reason almost no one had looked closely at Eunice's flock in those 47 years was not that the flock was hidden. It was visible from the road. Neighbors knew Eunice Tate kept chickens, the way neighbors knew things about each other in a rural community, as ambient knowledge that did not require investigation. What had kept the flock from broader notice was a combination of factors that, individually, were unremarkable, and that together had produced 50 years of obscurity for a genetically significant population. The commercial poultry industry in the 20th century had moved decisively towards standardized breeds, birds selected for uniform size, uniform laying schedules, and disease resistance profiles suited to industrial production. Heritage and heirloom poultry breeds had become, by the 1970s and 1980s, primarily the concern of a small community of breed preservationists who work through organizations like the American Poultry Association and maintained registries of recognized breeds with documented standards. Eunice's flock did not fit into this system cleanly. It was not a recognized breed with a documented standard. It was a family line, maintained through informal selective breeding for 4 generations, that had diverged from any standardized breed enough that it did not match the breed standards a preservationist would be checking against. To a poultry preservationist doing a survey, Eunice's birds might have looked like an unusual but unremarkable mixed flock. Interesting-looking chickens of uncertain origin, the kind of thing rural households kept, without it meaning anything in particular. Hal Pruitt, the Anderson County Extension agent, had been an exception. He had visited Eunice's property in the 1990s on a routine call about something unrelated, a request for advice about a pest problem in her garden, and had noticed the flock and had asked about it. Eunice had told him the family story. Hal had thought it was interesting and had mentioned it to a few people over the years, including eventually whoever had been doing extension work on poultry genetics at Clemson at various points. Nothing had come of these mentions until 2022, when Marisol Hayes's blog post had given the story a specific, photographable hook that made it possible for someone like Renata to recognize what she was looking at. Eunice had not minded the obscurity. She had told Renata, over coffee, "I wasn't trying to keep it a secret. I just didn't think anyone outside the family would care." She had said, "My mother didn't think anyone would care either. It was just our chickens." The genetic analysis had taken 7 months. Renata had collected blood samples from 12 birds across 3 generations of the flock. Eunice maintained careful breeding records, a habit she had inherited from Idella, which made it possible to identify which birds were most closely related to the original line Eunice remembered from her mother's flock in the 1970s. Renata had sent the samples to a collaborating laboratory that maintained one of the most comprehensive databases of chicken breed genetics in North America, including a specialized dataset of blue egg gene variants collected from poultry populations across the Americas. The results had been, in Renata's assessment, remarkable in a specific and narrow way that took some explanation to convey to people outside her field. The blue eggshell color in chickens was caused by a gene that inserted a retrovirus-derived sequence near a gene involved in pigment deposition, causing the pigment biliverdin to be deposited throughout the eggshell rather than just on the surface, producing the characteristic blue-green color. This gene variant had originated in South American chicken populations, likely in Chile, based on historical and genetic evidence, and had spread to other regions through the breeds that carried it, including the birds that had eventually become the basis for the Araucana and Americana breeds recognized by modern poultry associations. The modern recognized breeds carried versions of this gene variant that had been, over a century of breeding and crossing, recombined with genetic material from many other chicken populations. The original Chilean variant, in its less recombined form, closer to what had existed in South American populations before the breed was exported and standardized, was, according to the database Renata worked with, essentially undocumented in any living North American population. Eunice's flock carried a version of the blue egg gene variant that was, in the database's comparative analysis, closer to the documented historical Chilean samples than any other North American population in the dataset. The flock's overall genetic profile showed minimal evidence of crossing with 20th century commercial Araucana or Americana lines, consistent with a population that had been maintained through closed breeding within one family for over a century, with the original 1880s import as its founding stock. The ear tuft trait, the smaller body size, the specific plumage coloration, these were, in Renata's analysis, consistent with a population that had diverged from the documented Araucana standard because it had never been bred toward that standard. It had been bred for over 100 years toward what one South Carolina family wanted from their chickens: good laying, hardiness, and the blue eggs that had become, by Florence's time, simply what their chickens did. Renata had called Eunice in October with the results. She had said, "Eunice, the blue egg gene in your flock is closer to the original Chilean source population than anything else documented in North America." She had said, "Your family's birds may represent the least recombined surviving lineage of the original blue egg import, the birds that came before the commercial breeds existed." Eunice had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "So Aaron Whitfield's chickens?" Renata had said, "As far as the genetics can tell us, yes. The line your great-great-grandmother kept from her brother's ship in the 1880s, that line is still mostly intact in your flock." Eunice had said, 140 years. Renata had said, "Approximately." Eunice had said, "4 women?" Renata had said, "I'm sorry?" Eunice had said, "Florence's mother, then Florence, then my mother Idella, then me. 4 women kept this flock going for 140 years. Renata had been quiet. She had said, "Yes, that's right." Eunice had said, "What happens now?" Renata had said, "I'd like to document the line formally, genetic profile, breed characteristics, the family history. I'd like to work with you on a breeding program to make sure the line is maintained and doesn't get diluted now that people will want it." She had said, "And I think this should have a name." Eunice had said, "A name?" Renata had said, "A breed designation, or at least a strain designation that records what this is and where it came from." Eunice had thought about it. She had said, "My grandmother Florence always just called them the blue hens, not a name exactly, just what they were." Renata had said, "That works as a starting point." Eunice had said, "My mother used to say Florence's blue hens when she wanted to specify which chickens she meant if we had other birds around too." Renata had said, "Florence's blue." Eunice had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "Florence kept them for 40 years. My mother kept them for 33. I've kept them for 47. Renata had said, "And the name should be for the person who started it." The same way Eunice's account of Aaron Whitfield credited him with bringing them. But it was Florence who built the breeding line into something specific. Eunice had said, "Yes, Florence's blue." The formal documentation had been published in a poultry genetics journal in the spring of the following year, under the designation Florence's blue, a heritage strain descended from a 19th century Chilean import, maintained through closed family breeding in upcountry South Carolina for over a century, carrying a minimally recombined variant of the original blue eggshell gene. The publication had attracted attention from the heritage poultry community in a way that surprised Eunice, who had not anticipated that a flock she had always considered simply her chickens would become a subject of interest to breed preservationists across the country. She had received calls and letters from people interested in acquiring breeding stock, from poultry associations interested in establishing a formal breed standard, from a children's educational farm in North Carolina that wanted to display birds from the line. She had handled all of this the way she handled most things, without hurry, considering each request on its merits, declining the ones that seemed likely to dilute or mismanage the line, and agreeing to the ones that seemed likely to help maintain it responsibly. She had worked with Renata to establish a small breeding program that distributed carefully selected pairs to 3 other heritage poultry keepers, people Renata had vetted for their breeding practices and their commitment to maintaining the line's genetic integrity, rather than crossing it for novelty. Eunice's granddaughter Tasha, who was 19 and had grown up visiting the Pickens County property on weekends, had started spending more time at the farm after the publication. She had been working with Eunice on the breeding records, the same kind of records Idella had kept and Florence before her, now digitized but following the same logic. Which birds bred to which birds, producing which characteristics, generation after generation. Tasha had asked Eunice on one of these weekends whether it felt strange to have the flock be famous, in its small way, after 50 years of nobody paying attention. Eunice had thought about it. She had said, "It doesn't feel like the flock changed." She had said, "The flock is the same flock it was before Renata came. The eggs are the same color. The birds do the same things. What changed is that other people know about it now." Tasha had said, "Does that matter?" Eunice had said, "It matters for the flock's future. If something happened to me and nobody knew what this flock was, it might not continue. Now, if something happens to me, other people know what it is and why it matters, and there's a record." She had said, "That's worth something." She had looked at the chicken yard, where the birds were moving in their late afternoon patterns, the slate blue and charcoal plumage catching the light. She had said, "But day to day, it's just the chickens. You feed them and you collect the eggs, and you watch which birds are doing well and which ones aren't, and you make decisions about breeding based on what you see. That part hasn't changed, and it isn't going to change." She had said, "That part is the actual thing. The rest is just other people finding out about the actual thing." Tasha had said, "Florence is blue." Eunice had said, "That's the name now." Tasha had said, "Do you think Florence would have liked having her name on it?" Eunice had thought about it. She had said, "I think Florence would have said the chickens didn't need a name." She had said, "But I think she'd have been glad that someone eventually understood what she'd built." She had said, "That's different from needing the recognition. It's just someone understanding." Tasha had nodded. She had picked up the egg basket. She had said, "I'll get started on the evening collection." Eunice had said, "Take the east coop first. The number 6 hen has been broody. Don't disturb her nest." Tasha had said, "Got it." She had walked toward the coops. Eunice had stayed on the porch for a moment, watching her granddaughter move through the yard with the basket. The same yard Eunice had moved through for 47 years. The same yard Idella had moved through for 33 years before that. The same line of birds, slate blue and charcoal, laying eggs the color of a stormy ocean, continuing, the way it had continued since a ship's carpenter named Aaron Whitfield had carried some chickens off a boat in Charleston in the 1880s and given them to his sister, because that was what you did with surviving livestock at the end of a voyage. 140 years, 4 women. The chickens didn't know any of it. They just did what chickens did: ate, scratched, laid eggs, raised their young when allowed to. The history was not in the chickens. The history was in the keeping. Eunice had been keeping for 47 years. Tasha was starting to keep. That was how it continued. That was how it had always continued. Aaron Whitfield had been 26 years old in 1883, working as a ship's carpenter on a merchant vessel that ran between Charleston and ports along the Pacific coast of South America, a route that took cargoes south and brought back goods that included, on this particular voyage, a quantity of guano fertilizer from Chilean deposits, a valuable commodity in the post-war South Carolina agricultural economy, where soil depletion from decades of cotton monoculture had created strong demand for fertilizer imports. The voyage had taken the ship to Valparaiso, where it had spent 11 days loading cargo. Crew members commonly went ashore during long port stays, and several had returned with live animals, a practice that was not unusual on voyages of this length, since fresh eggs and occasionally fresh meat were valuable additions to a ship's provisions for the return voyage, and surviving animals could be sold or given away at the home port if they were not consumed en route. Aaron had acquired 6 chickens in Valparaiso, 4 hens and 2 roosters, according to the account passed down through the family, though the family account by the time it reached Eunice had compressed and simplified details that had likely been more specific in earlier tellings. The birds had been kept in a crate on deck for the return voyage, which took approximately 7 weeks. 4 of the 6 had survived the voyage, 2 hens and 2 roosters, according to the family account, though Eunice herself had noted, telling the story to Renata, that the numbers in family stories tended to drift over generations, and she would not stake anything on the precision of 4. What was more reliably established, because it was the part of the story that mattered practically and had therefore been preserved more carefully, was that the surviving birds laid blue eggs, that this was noticed immediately by Aaron's sister when he gave the birds to her, and that the blue eggs had been, from the first laying, considered remarkable enough that the family had kept careful track of which birds were descended from the Chile chickens, as they were called in the earliest generation of the family's account. Eunice had a single physical artifact connecting the family to this story, a small leather-bound ledger that had belonged to Florence, dated from 1923 to 1958, in which Florence had recorded breeding decisions for her flock. The ledger's first page contained a note in Florence's handwriting that read, "Begun this book the spring my mother gave me 4 hens and a rooster from the Chile line, descended from the birds my Uncle Aaron brought to Charleston in 1883. Mother said, 'These are special, and you should keep good account of them. I intend to.'" The ledger continued for 35 years, with entries that were, by any standard, a remarkably consistent record of selective breeding decisions. Which hens were paired with which roosters, what the resulting chicks looked like, which birds were kept for further breeding and which were not, and notes about egg color, size, and laying frequency that Florence had recorded, with the specificity of someone who understood that the records were the only way to maintain consistency across generations of birds whose individual lifespans were short. Florence had given the ledger to Idella when Idella married and took birds from the line to Pickens County in 1943. Idella had continued the ledger, the same physical book, her handwriting beginning on the page after Florence's last entry, for another 18 years, until 1976, the year she died. The ledger had then come to Eunice. Eunice had continued the ledger. This was the detail that, when Renata had first seen the ledger during her research visits, that affected her more than almost anything else in the investigation. The ledger was a single physical object, leather-bound, the pages now brittle at the edges, the ink faded to brown in the earliest sections, that contained in 3 different handwritings 100 years of breeding decisions for the same flock. Florence's handwriting, careful, slightly formal, the handwriting of a woman educated in the early 20th century rural school system, writing in full sentences with dates carefully noted. Idella's handwriting, looser, faster, the handwriting of someone who had grown up watching her mother keep the records and had absorbed the format without needing to think about why it mattered, continuing the same columns and the same kinds of notes without explanation because the explanation had never been necessary. You just kept the ledger the way you just fed the chickens. Eunice's handwriting, similar to Idella's but distinctly her own, continuing into the present. The most recent entries from the previous autumn's breeding selections, made in preparation for the spring hatching season. Renata had asked Eunice, holding the ledger carefully, whether she had ever thought about what the ledger represented. A continuous documentary record, in the handwriting of 3 generations, of a breeding program that had no formal institutional standing, but had been more rigorous in its way than many formally recognized breed programs Renata had reviewed in her career. Eunice had said, "I never thought about it as a document." She had said, "I thought about it as the book. You wrote in the book what you decided and why, so that next year you'd remember, and so that whoever came after you would know what had been tried and what had worked." Renata had said, "That's exactly what a breeding record is supposed to be." Eunice had said, "Then I suppose it is one." She had looked at the ledger. She had said, "My mother used to say, 'The book remembers what we forget.'" She had said, "I've forgotten a lot over 47 years. The book hasn't." The breeding decisions recorded in the ledger told their own story, separate from the genetic analysis, but consistent with it. Florence's early entries showed a breeding program focused on establishing consistency, taking the variable founding stock from the 1880s import, whatever the actual numbers and characteristics had been, and selecting, generation after generation, for birds that bred true to a specific type. The blue egg color, a hardy constitution suited to upcountry South Carolina's climate, and good laying performance through the winter months, when egg production mattered most to a household that depended on the flock for food. By the 1930s, Florence's entries showed a flock that had stabilized. The variation between individual birds had narrowed. The blue egg color was consistent across nearly all hens, and Florence's notes shifted from establishing the type to maintaining it. Avoiding overly close breeding between closely related birds, which she had learned through experience produced weaker chicks, and periodically introducing a rooster from outside the immediate breeding group, though, crucially, always from birds that were themselves descended from the original line, maintained by a network of relatives and neighbors who had also received birds from the original stock at various points, and who Florence traded with specifically to maintain genetic diversity within the line without introducing outside blood. This detail, that Florence had maintained a network of related breeders to preserve genetic diversity within a closed line, was, in Renata's assessment, sophisticated breeding management that anticipated, by decades, formal genetic principles that would not be widely understood in agricultural breeding until much later in the 20th century. Florence had not had the vocabulary of population genetics. She had had 40 years of observation and a ledger that told her what had worked and what hadn't. By the time Idella took over the line in 1943, the network of related breeders that Florence had maintained had mostly dispersed. Relatives had moved away, properties had changed hands. The rural communities that had supported this kind of informal breeding network had been changing under the broader pressures that were changing rural South Carolina in the mid-20th century. Idella had maintained the line as a single, closed flock, without the outside genetic exchange Florence had relied on. This was, Renata explained to Eunice, the period that should have caused problems. A closed flock, bred without outside genetic input, for over 30 years under Idella, and then continuing under Eunice, should have shown signs of inbreeding depression. Reduced fertility, smaller clutch sizes, increased susceptibility to disease. Renata had asked Eunice how the flock had avoided this. Eunice had said, "My mother culled hard." Renata had said, "What does that mean specifically?" Eunice had said, "Every year she'd look at the new chicks and the older birds, and she'd decide which ones to keep for breeding and which ones weren't going to be bred. The ones that weren't quite right, slower to grow, smaller eggs, anything that seemed off, those didn't get bred, even if they were otherwise fine birds to keep for eggs or meat. Only the best birds bred forward." She had said, "I do the same thing, every year. It's in the ledger. You can see which birds we picked and which we didn't, and mostly the reasoning if you read the notes carefully." Renata had read the notes carefully. The pattern was there across both Idella's and Eunice's sections of the ledger. A consistent, generation-by-generation selection for vigor, the specific quality that Renata's field would call hybrid vigor, except that this flock wasn't a hybrid. It was a closed line that had been protected from inbreeding depression through exactly the kind of rigorous culling that population geneticists recommended for managing small closed populations. Except that Idella and Eunice had arrived at this practice through observation and the ledger's accumulated record, not through reading population genetics literature. She had said to Eunice, "This is, functionally, a textbook small population management program." Eunice had said, "It's just culling hard." Renata had said, "Yes, that's what the textbook recommends." Eunice had said, "Well," she had said, "my mother didn't need a textbook. She had the book." Tasha had asked, during one of her weekend visits after the publication, whether Eunice had ever considered the possibility that the family story about Aaron Whitfield wasn't entirely accurate, that some detail had been embellished or simplified over 140 years of retelling. Eunice had said, "Of course, some details have drifted. The number of birds, probably. Maybe other things." She had said, "But the core of it, that the line came from somewhere specific, that it came across an ocean, that it's been kept deliberately since the 1880s, that part the genetics confirmed." Renata's lab found a lineage close to the Chilean source population. That's not something a family story could accidentally get right if it wasn't true. Tasha had said, so the genetics prove the story. Eunice had said, the genetics prove the part of the story that mattered. The exact number of chickens in 1883 doesn't matter. What matters is that someone brought birds with this gene back from Chile, and the family kept that line going deliberately for 140 years. She had said, a ledger proves the deliberate part. The genetics proves the line part. Together, that's the story. Tasha had said, and the parts that drifted? Eunice had said, those are just family. Every family's stories drift a little. That's what makes them stories instead of ledgers. She had smiled slightly when she said this, the small private amusement of someone who had spent a long time thinking about the difference between a family story and a documentary record, and had concluded that both were valuable, in different ways, and that the value of each did not depend on the other being perfectly precise. The 3 breeding pairs that Eunice and Renata had placed with other heritage poultry keepers in 2023 had been selected carefully, not just for genetic diversity, which mattered for the long-term health of the line now that it would exist in more than one location, but for the specific qualities Eunice looked for in anyone she was going to trust with birds from this flock. One pair had gone to a small heritage farm in the North Carolina mountains, run by a couple who maintained several other heritage poultry lines, and who Renata had vetted extensively. One pair had gone to a 4-H program in Anderson County, Hal Pruitt's doing, since Hal had finally gotten his 30-year wish to see the flock recognized, and had immediately set about making sure young people in his county would have access to it. And one pair had gone to a small farm outside Columbia, run by a woman named Eunice Tate, who taught agricultural science at a public high school, and who had reached out specifically because she wanted to use Florence's blue as a teaching example, genetics, breed history, and the specific value of family-maintained agricultural lines. Eunice had visited Denise's farm in the fall, the only one of the 3 placement visits she had made in person. She had walked the new coop with Denise and had looked at how the birds were settling in, and had answered Denise's questions about the breeding records and what to watch for. Denise had asked, near the end of the visit, "What do you want your students to understand about these birds?" Eunice had thought about it. She had said, "I'm not sure it's my place to say what your students should understand. You're the teacher." Denise had said, "But it's your family's flock. You must have thought about what matters about it." Eunice had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "I suppose what I'd want them to understand is that this happened because 4 women, one after another, decided that something was worth keeping track of. Not because anyone told them to, and not because they knew it would turn out to be significant. They just thought, this is ours, and it's worth keeping right, so we're going to write down what we do and why." She had said, "That's not a complicated thing. Anybody could do it. Most people don't, because it doesn't seem like it matters at the time." She had said, "It only looks significant from the outside, later, after 140 years. From the inside, every single year, it just looked like feed the chickens, write in the book, decide which ones to breed next spring." Denise had said, "That's a good thing for them to understand." Eunice had said, "I think so too." She had looked at the new birds settling into their coop, the slate blue and charcoal plumage already familiar to her, the same coloration she had seen every day of her life. She had said, "Tell them it's not magic. It's just not stopping." She had driven back to Pickens County that evening. The ledger was on the kitchen table, where it always was, between uses, in the specific place it had occupied for as long as Eunice could remember, and before that, for as long as Idella had kept it on that same table, and Florence on hers. Tasha's entries were starting to appear in the most recent pages, in a 4th handwriting now, the careful, uncertain hand of someone who had been keeping the book for less than a year, and was still learning what details mattered enough to write down. She would learn. The book would teach her, the way it had taught everyone who had kept it. Not quickly, not all at once. The way the flock itself had been built, one careful decision at a time, every spring, for 140 years. 4 hens and 2 roosters off a ship in 1883, becoming 41 birds in a Pickens County yard in the present. Each one carrying, in its blood and in its blue-green eggs, the accumulated record of every decision that had been made about it and its ancestors since before anyone alive had been born. The chickens didn't know any of this. They just did what chickens did. The keeping was in the people. There had been one visit, in the spring after the publication, that Eunice had found more difficult than the others. A commercial hatchery representative from a large operation in Georgia who had driven up uninvited after reading about Florence's Blue in a poultry trade publication. His name was Marcus Seeley, and he was polite and well prepared, with a folder of materials describing what his company called a heritage authentication program, a marketing initiative that allowed commercial hatcheries to sell birds described as descended from documented heritage lines, with premium pricing attached to the heritage designation. He had said, "Mrs. Tate, we'd be interested in incorporating Florence's Blue genetics into a limited heritage line. We'd maintain full attribution. The marketing materials would tell your family's story." He had said it would also mean broader availability. Right now, this line exists in 4 small flocks. Our hatchery could make birds with this lineage available to thousands of backyard poultry keepers across the Southeast. Eunice had listened to the full presentation. She had said, "What would happen to the line in your hatchery?" Marcus had said, "We'd establish a breeding nucleus using stock from your flock and propagate from there." He had said, "Standard commercial hatchery practice. We'd be producing thousands of birds a year within a few seasons." Eunice had said, "Bred how?" Marcus had said, "Our standard breeding protocols are designed for consistency and disease resistance at scale." He had said, "We might introduce some outside genetics to improve certain production characteristics. Egg-laying rate, primarily. Birds with this kind of heritage background sometimes lay less frequently than commercial layers, and our customers expect a certain baseline." Eunice had said, "So you'd cross it with something else?" Marcus had said, "A small percentage, to optimize." Eunice had said, "Mr. Seeley." She had said it gently, but it had stopped him. She had said, "My great-great-grandmother kept a network of relatives breeding this line so it wouldn't need outside blood. My grandmother kept a book for 35 years, recording every decision so the line would stay what it was. My mother kept the book another 18 years. I've kept it 47. She had said the whole point for 140 years was not introducing something else to optimize it. The whole point was keeping it what it was. She had said, "I understand that's not how your hatchery operates, and that's fine. Your hatchery has its own purpose. But this flock's purpose has been the opposite of yours for 4 generations, and I'm not going to change that now because someone wants to sell more birds." Marcus had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I understand." He had said, "For what it's worth, I think that's the right call." He had said it, Eunice thought, with more sincerity than his presentation had contained, and she had appreciated that, even as she declined his offer. He had left without the materials he'd hoped to leave behind. Renata had asked about the visit afterward. Eunice had described it. Renata had said, "That's going to keep happening, probably, as the line gets more attention." Eunice had said, "I know." Renata had said, "Are you worried about it?" Eunice had said, "I've said no to people before. Hal Pruitt mentioned this flock to people for 30 years, and nobody came except you. And you came because you are the right kind of person to come." She had said, "I expect most of the people who come now won't be the right kind. That's fine. I'll say no to them too." Renata had said, "And if someone offers something that's actually good for the line?" Eunice had said, "Then I'll say yes, the way I said yes to you, and to Denise, and to the 4-H program." She had said, "The test isn't whether they're offering something. The test is whether what they're offering helps the line keep being what it is." In the summer after the publication, The Pickens County Historical Society had asked Eunice if she would be willing to have the ledger digitized and included in the society's archive, not removing the physical book, which Eunice had made clear would stay in the family, but creating a complete photographic record of every page that researchers could access without handling the fragile original. Eunice had agreed. The digitization had taken a single afternoon, with the Historical Society volunteer photographing each page under careful lighting while Eunice sat at the kitchen table watching. A ledger open page by page in front of the camera for the first time in its existence. 100 years of 3 handwritings, soon to be 4, captured and preserved in a form that could not be lost to fire or flood, or the simple wearing away of old paper and binding that had already begun to affect the earliest pages. The volunteer, a retired teacher named Mr. Aldridge, had asked, partway through the afternoon, whether Eunice wanted to add anything to the digital record, a statement, an introduction, anything that would help future researchers understand what they were looking at. Eunice had thought about it. She had asked for a piece of paper and had written something out by hand, which Mr. Aldridge had then photographed as the final page of the digital archive, positioned after Florence's first entry and before everything that followed, as a kind of frame for the whole record. What she had written was, "This book was started by my grandmother Florence in 1923, with 4 hens and a rooster descended from birds her uncle Aaron Whitfield brought from Chile to Charleston in 1883. My mother Idella kept it after her, and I have kept it after my mother. My granddaughter Tasha is starting to keep it now. Between us, that is 4 generations and 100 years of writing down what we did with these chickens and why. None of us thought this would matter to anyone outside the family. We kept the book because that is what you do with something you intend to keep going. You write down what worked so the next person doesn't have to guess. If you are reading this and you did not know our family, I hope it is useful to you. If you are reading this and you are one of us, keep going the way we did. Write down what you decide. The book remembers what we forget." Mr. Aldridge had read this over before photographing it. He had said, "This is a remarkable piece of writing, Mrs. Tate." Eunice had said, "It's not writing, it's just what's true." He had smiled. He had said, "That's usually what remarkable writing is." He had photographed the page. The digital archive had gone live on the Historical Society's website in the fall, with Eunice's framing statement as its introduction, followed by 100 years of breeding records in 3, soon 4 handwritings, available to anyone who wanted to look. Tasha had finished her first full year of keeping the ledger the following spring. Her entries had become more confident, still recognizably her own handwriting, distinct from Eunice's and from Idella's and from Florence's, but following the same format, the same categories of observation, the same logic that had governed every entry for 100 years. She had asked Eunice, looking back over her first year's entries beside Eunice's from the same period, whether she was doing it right. Eunice had read through Tasha's entries carefully. She had said, "You're doing it the way I did it my first year." Tasha had said, "Is that good?" Eunice had said, "It means you're paying attention to the right things. The format will become more yours over time, the way mine became more mine, and your great-grandmother's became more hers. But the right things to pay attention to, you've got those already." Tasha had said, "How do you know I've got the right things?" Eunice had pointed to one of Tasha's entries, a note about a hen that had stopped laying earlier than expected, with observations about the hen's behavior and condition over several weeks, and a tentative conclusion about what might be causing it. Eunice had said, "This, you watched something for 3 weeks before you wrote down what you thought it meant. That's the right thing. Most people would either not notice or notice and immediately decide what it meant without watching long enough to be sure." Tasha had said, "I wasn't sure I was right." Eunice had said, "You still aren't, probably. That's fine. Write down what you saw and what you think it might mean, and keep watching. In a few years, you'll have enough entries about hens that stop laying early to know more than you do now." She had said, that's what the book is for, not to be right immediately, to get more right over time. Tasha had looked at the ledger. Florence's careful, formal hand at the front, fading to brown ink. Idela's faster, looser hand in the middle. Eunice's hand continuing into recent years. And now her own hand, 4 entries old, at the back. She had said, 100 years from now, someone might be reading what I wrote today. Eunice had said, maybe. Tasha had said, that's strange to think about. Eunice had said, it didn't feel strange to Florence when she started. It just felt like keeping good account of something. She had said, it'll feel the same to you, mostly. Every day it'll just be, feed the chickens, write in the book. She had said, the 100 years part only shows up if you stop and think about it from the outside, the way you're doing right now. From the inside, it's just Tuesday. Tasha had laughed. She had said, just Tuesday. Eunice had said, that's the whole secret, if there is one. You don't keep something for 100 years by thinking about the 100 years. You keep it by doing Tuesday right, and then doing it again, for as many Tuesdays as you get. She had closed the ledger and set it back on the kitchen table, in the place it had occupied for 100 years, where it would stay until the next time someone needed to write something down, which, with 41 chickens in the yard and a spring hatching season coming, would not be very long. The chickens moved in the yard outside the window, slate blue and charcoal against the green grass, laying eggs the color of a stormy ocean, the way they had for 140 years, the way they would keep doing as long as someone kept the book and fed them and decided every spring which ones would breed forward into whatever came next. That was the whole of it.